Good morning, Pastor Ed Kropa here from Hope Lutheran Church in Freehold, New Jersey, with a new week of Lenten devotions beginning on Monday, March the 15th, 2021. Once again, for our Lenten devotions, we're using a booklet entitled Beyond Question by Pastor Eric Burtness, in which he looks at the many questions that Jesus asked during his ministry of others, particularly his own disciples, that allowed him to make some important points about the life of faith and for them to think about how they fit into the bigger picture of what it meant to follow Jesus and to follow the way of Jesus. Our reading this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount, beginning at verse 13, where Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." It's in that last verse, "let your light shine before others," that may sound familiar because that's what we use as part of the baptismal service. That part of becoming a Christian is to share the light of Christ with the world. Let me say a little bit more about that before we finish this morning. But this idea that let your lights shine before others so that they may see your good works and not think you're better, not glorify you, not give you praise, but give glory to your Father in heaven. Before we get to Pastor Burtness's thoughts on this, I want to make a couple of points about salt, and then afterwards we're going to talk about light. But basically, salt it's used in many different ways, many different purposes, even in our own time. But in ancient times, its two major tasks were either to preserve or to season. So here's a story about the preserving properties, I should say, of salt. Dennis Kinlaw, the former Asbury Seminary professor and Asbury College president, tells a story about growing up in rural Lumberton, North Carolina during the Depression. It was Dennis's job, apparently, as a young boy, to rub salt into the meat that his father brought home from hunting. And he would rub salt into the meat until his young muscles were sore. And finally, when it was thoroughly salted, he would hang it up in the storehouse. One day company arrived, so Dennis's mother asked him to get some pork out of the storehouse. Dennis ran out, got a big piece of pork off a hook, brought it into the kitchen. He laid it on his mother's cutting board and left. And he was just about out the front door when he heard his mother yell, "Dennis!" Young Dennis knew from experience that when his mother screamed his name like that, he was in trouble. So he slunk his way to the kitchen and stood in the doorway, afraid to go in. Looking up at his mother from the doorway, he noticed that she was not glaring at him, but rather staring down at the meat. So Dennis looked and noticed something unusual. He would say that it was the first time in his life he ever saw meat move. And stepping closer, he noticed maggots pouring out of the slice his mother had made into the pork. And Dennis thought for sure that he was going to get it, but all Mom said to him was, "Not enough salt, Dennis. Not enough salt." Now, it's easy to want to blame Hollywood or the media or television or conservatives or the liberals or the government or whatever, big business corporations, to blame for the decay in our culture that we unfortunately recognize. But maybe, just maybe, the real problem is not enough salt. As David Ward points out, not enough salt. If we feel the world is decaying around us, the problem may very well be not enough salt. And then the other use of salt is to season. A number of years ago, this is a fellow by the name of Den Guptill, writes that a buddy of his several years ago spent a couple of months in Zambia in Africa, and he told me that the staple food there was called sema. For breakfast, you got sema. At lunch, you got sema. For supper, you got sema. Great heaping piles of sema. And what you ask is sema? Well, sema is ground maize and water. And John said that it tasted like a cross between oatmeal and wallpaper paste. And there was no milk for it, no cream for it, no sugar for it. And his buddy said that the only way that you could make it taste any better was by adding salt. And so this Den Guptill says, I remain convinced that without the Christian church, this world would be much like sema, flavorless and dull. Well, let's hear what Pastor Burtness has to say. Salt is indispensable in our lives, he writes. It's essential for all the life that flourishes in oceans and under saltwater seas. It's been used for several thousand years to preserve food, to keep it from spoiling. Our bodies can't function without it. Before we're born, we grow and develop in a salt solution. Without salt, our hearts would not beat, our blood would not flow, our muscles would not work properly. Blood, sweat, and tears all contain salt. In biblical times, salt was so precious that it may have been used to pay Roman soldiers. The word salary, in fact, comes from the Latin word for salt. And maybe that's why we say the people who deserve to be rewarded or paid are worth their salt. Jesus compares us to this indispensable, life-sustaining, precious substance when he says, you are the salt of the earth. He also says, you are the light of the world. Those are declarative statements. You are salt. You are light. Jesus doesn't say, if you wouldn't mind when you have some spare time, could you be salt? Could you be a moral and faithful preservative in a world showing signs of decay? You don't get to vote on this either. As a follower of Jesus, you are salt and you are light. Following Jesus means being salt and light in the midst of the decay brought about by greed, corporate scandals, violence, homelessness, poverty, and more. The salt and light that you bring may not seem like much to you, but they make a difference to the people that you encounter from day to day. There's no hope of restoration for salt that loses its taste, but there's always hope for us. Our saltiness is renewed, refreshed, and restored as we gather with other salty characters in the family of God, he writes, as we ask for and receive forgiveness, and as Christ makes us new each day. We are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. A few more thoughts about this idea of being the light of the world. In the Canadian province of New Brunswick, there is a church building on Deer Island that for many years has served as a physical lighthouse to the fishermen of that community. It's not that the building has any unique architectural design that would resemble a nautical lighthouse. In fact, it resembles the style of many church buildings built a century ago. It's the location of the building, you see, that makes it ideal as a lighthouse. The worship house for the Church of Christ in Lord's Cove is elevated a few hundred feet higher than the cove below. For many years, the fishermen returning to port could see the steeple of that church, the church building, for many miles from the water. In days before electronic equipment to guide them home, fishermen would aim for the church building when returning to port. From miles away, the men would aim for the church or the light in its steeple. That course of direction would guide them past all the ledges and shoals and safely back to the home port. In the 1960s, the government installed navigational lights for the fishermen, but prior to that, the church building had served as the lighthouse. Just as the physical light of that building was a light that led many safely home, so also the light of Jesus Christ leads all who will follow his light to their heavenly home. May we also serve as a light for Christ to guide others to the home port of heaven. So writes Gordon Weatherly. And then also, a fellow by the name of James Lee points out a lot of trucks, and you've seen this as well, have a sticker on the back that says, "How's my driving?" And then there's the phone number to report. It's supposed to make the the driver accountable. This fellow, James Lee, apparently read that in Ireland people drive very, very courteously. They have roundabouts instead of lights. We still have a few. The Freehold circle's gone, though. I miss that. I remember taking driver's training in high school and being taught how to drive on a circle. You always have to let the cars on the circle get out before you get off, before you get on. If you follow that basic rule that I learned in driver's training, you're okay. But it doesn't seem to work as well here in the U.S., and circles and roundabouts are being replaced all the time. Freehold Circle being just one example. But one man said that most people drove, this is over in Ireland, drove very well and were courteous except for one group that he called the white van man. These were the people who drove company vehicles, which were frequently unmarked white vans. They didn't care how they treated the vehicle, let alone what havoc they caused others, because there was no company name or logo on these vans. They were anonymous drivers, in other words. Well, some Christians, this person points out, are like those van drivers. We don't care how we act or who we hurt. We're anonymous. Remember a lady, he says, who was turning right at the light one day, and I was turning left, and if you've read your driver's handbook, you'll find that when you're turning right, you turn into the outside lane. The person turning left into the inside lane. This is to keep the traffic flowing. Well, he turned into my lane. This lady flipped me off and cussed me out. The problem was that on the back glass of her car was a sticker that told the name of the church she attended. And so he asked the question, if God were to place a sticker on your back that asked, "How's my living?" or "How's my attitude?" what would others say about you? And then there's a story from Dr. A.W. Mays of Austin, Texas. He talks of an incident that took place in his hometown of Austin concerning a street light. Apparently in Austin there was this high crime area, and the residents of the community petitioned the city to put up streetlights in this high crime area. Dr. Mays stated that once the lights were up, crime subsided for a while, but someone took a rock or something, knocked out the streetlights, and crime in that area resumed. And this took place over and over again. As they replaced the light, it got knocked out, so the city just gave up and left that particular area unlit, to the chagrin of the petitioners and other residents of the community. His point was that the world would rather not have light, and yet we're called to be light. Stories told about a young man who became a new Christian. After a while, the pastor asked him, well, what have you done to live out your Christian life since you became a believer? And he said, well, I'm still just a learner. Well, said the pastor, when you light a candle, do you light it to make the candle more comfortable, or do you light it to give light? And he replied, well, to give light. He said, do you expect it to give light after it's half burned, or when you first light it? And he replied, well, as soon as I light it. Very well, was the reply. Go and do likewise. Begin at once. We're called to be light for the world, to spread Christ's light. Questions to ponder. That Pastor Burtness asks, name some people who are the salt of the earth in your life or in your community. How do they maintain their saltiness? What is it about them that would lead you to describe them as being the salt of the earth? And then another question to think about. What can you do to bring salt or light into a place that needs it? Well, let's close this morning with prayer. Dear God, guide me and teach me to be salt and light in the world. When I'm running on empty and feel that I have nothing left to give, restore me and fill me again. Let my light shine and bring glory to you. In Jesus' precious and holy name. Amen. Some important thoughts to consider as you begin a new work week, school week. What does it mean to be the salt of the earth, the light of the world? And what can that mean in your own life? Well, we'll see you again tomorrow. Hope today gets your week off to a good start. And We'll be back here again with you tomorrow morning. Take care. Bye-bye.